I was not able to visit the exhibition of wedding dresses and bridal bouquets that was held in Astbury Church during the first Heritage and Antiques Festival. So it was lovely to see the exhibits through the photographs and to see the way in which these represent a small history of the development of the wedding dress over a period of 2 centuries. Whether they approached their wedding day with eager anticipation or with apprehension, whether they marry in haste or after a seemingly endless engagement, the bride's mind is often focused on that essential element, the wedding dress. In paintings, in photographs, in letters, in diaries, and in newspaper reports, and nowadays in videos, what the bride wore can be accorded suitable importance. If a wedding is an event, a rite of passage, the wedding dress itself provides a major and sometimes symbolic part of the planning, the pageantry, and the ritual. The fashion for brides to wear white for their wedding dresses is said to date from the occasion of Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert in 1840. It seems that other royal brides before her had worn white, but there was also a very strong tradition for them to wear dresses made of rich and sumptuous fabrics, velvets, silks, and cloth of gold and silver, rich colours, embroidered and sometimes embellished extravagantly with precious stones. The style of the dress was always of contemporary fashion, but for royalty and noble women it was the magnificence of the dress and the message it contained in terms of status and display that counted. We don't know exactly why Victoria chose to wear white, although one of her biographers has surmised that it was because it was the best colour for displaying the decorative lacework. We do know, because the dress still survives in the royal collections, both as an artefact that can be displayed and through paintings, exactly what it looked like. It was made of silk satin from Spitalfields and trimmed with lace made by the lace makers of the villages of Beer and Honiton in Devon, to a design that was later destroyed to preserve its uniqueness, although Victoria claimed that it was made to an old pattern. The dress was made in the style of the day, with a silhouette created by a pinched waist, a wide skirt held out by a multitude of petticoats, puffed sleeves, and an off-the-shoulder neckline with a Bertha collar. The outfit was finished with a trailing lace veil which no longer survives. A lasting symbol of her union with her beloved Albert, Victoria took it with her, wrapped round her like a shroud, in her coffin. Her dress was rich and expensive, but different from what had gone earlier, and it helped to establish the concept of the white wedding. White, of course, symbolises purity in Western culture, and so women embarking on second marriages often chose other colours, as did those who could not afford the luxury of a gown which had very limited use. The wedding veil, however, comes from a much older culture, for Roman brides wore saffron veils in homage to the goddess of the hearth, Vesta, to symbolise their transition from girlhood to the responsibilities of matronhood and the home. This dress, which is part of the Congleton Museum collection and was the oldest on display at the exhibition, was not on a model, something which presents its own challenges. A photograph does not give a perfectly accurate colour representation, although colours in fabric change over time anyway. Queen Victoria's dress would have been a little bit whiter when she wore it, although nothing like the bright white of modern fabrics. Neither can a photograph give the texture and feel of the material, something that often provides a valuable clue when dating a piece of clothing. So what can the dress detective tell from the 3 photographs? Well, it is clearly Victorian, but Victoria reigned for 60 years, and over that time fashions changed a lot. There are some clues, however. The shoulder line is dropped, the neck is high, and the sleeves are fully gathered into the cuffs. These construction details, together with the double darts on the bodice, suggest that it was made somewhere between 1855 and 1870. The peplum, with its fishtail at the back, confirms this and moves the date nearer to post-1860. The hemline on the skirt is also a big giveaway. In the early 60s, the shape of the crinoline, which up until then had resembled a bell, began to change. The shape retained the fullness at the front, but began to elongate along the back of the skirt. This was the first step towards the later bustle style. In the hem of the skirt, this could be seen as a shaped hem with a slight train at the back of the dress. This was sometimes padded slightly to help to hold the shape. The style icon now was Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III of France. The sheen that can be seen in the photograph suggests a silk fabric, possibly a taffeta, as there seems to be some stiffness. But again, there were many silk fabrics in those times, and taffeta is only a guess. The purple in the stripe and dot pattern, however, suggests that the colour may have been achieved using an aniline rather than a natural dye, something that only happened after Perkin patented his purple dye in 1856. This dress, if it was a wedding dress, clearly fell into the category that amalgamated a luxurious fabric, expensive silk, with a colour and style that could be worn many times. It is not just a single occasion dress, and it could work for many different events. The dress has no provenance. We do not know who wore it, and really, we do not know whether it was a wedding dress and made for a bride, for a wedding guest, or for some other big occasion, such as the opening of the new town hall in 1866. A silk dress would have been beyond the means of the people who toiled in Congleton silk mills, and it is not a high-end couture dress, but it might well have been worn by a wife or daughter of one of Congleton's wealthier tradespeople or shop owners. The photograph of Councillor Susie Akers Smith shows her wearing a modern reconstruction of a dress that is part of the National Trust collection and which dates back to the same time as the dress in Congleton Museum. Historically, having an elaborate wedding gown was never just a matter of individual taste, but also of circumstances. The rich and affluent could afford to spend money on a dress that might rarely be worn again. But for those with fewer resources, a style and a fabric that would improve the longevity and the utility of the dress was an important consideration. Clothing was an expensive necessity, and even the wealthiest would not necessarily get the full value out of a special occasion dress. In an 1877 genre painting by Edward Killingworth Johnson, a young widow, dressed in plain black mourning, looks down sadly at the elaborate and beautiful wedding gown that, had her husband survived, she could have used for evening wear. Victorian mourning for a husband could last for at least 2 years, and by that time the dress would have been hopelessly old-fashioned, even if she would have wanted to wear such a sad reminder of happier times. Those in the labouring classes, of course, would hardly have been able to afford a special gown, and even a new bonnet might have stretched their resources. A dress of any kind was expected to last for a long time, although the British of every class were always dedicated followers of fashion. As an advanced industrial society, there was no equivalent in Britain to the peasant fashions and traditions that existed in some European countries, and British women, at weddings as in normal day-to-day life, wore clothes that were broadly similar in style, if not in cost or quality, to those worn by their richer counterparts. There was also a flourishing trade in second-hand clothing, and amongst the poorer echelons of society, wedding dresses could be purchased in what were called slop shops, the historical versions of second-hand shops. Wartime is one of the occasions fashion adapts to social change. During World War I, the role of women in society was brought into a new focus as they stepped up to the challenges of an armed conflict where men were suddenly in short supply on the home front. The practicalities of working in munitions factories or in occupations such as transport or farming meant that hems could no longer sweep the floor. Even after the conflict, as many women carried on the roles of breadwinner for families, practicality and usefulness influenced fashion, as did that new form of entertainment, the cinema. During the 1920s, the shorter skirts might not have been much over the ankle, but a boyish silhouette, dropped waistline and the cloche-style hat or the medieval veil became the vogue and were reflected in the weddings of that era. Interestingly too, the influence of the royal family and of the aristocracy as leaders of fashion carried on. The dress shown in Astbury Church that was worn by Phyllis Mellor when she married Charles Cadwallader, together with the clothes worn by the bridesmaids, is not very different from that worn by Princess Patricia of Connaught when she married Alexander Romsey in 1919 at Westminster Abbey. In times of universal hardship, especially in the 20th century, there are always different constraints. During World War II, there are stories of wedding dresses made from parachute silk, from tablecloths or sheets, or from refashioned or recycled clothes, though for some brides the only option was uniform or a tailored suit. The urgency of the times meant that many wartime weddings happened in haste, and for everybody, even Princess Elizabeth getting married in the immediate post-war years, coupons were a necessity and beautiful fabric was scarce. Coupons were donated from across the United Kingdom to help to provide the dress and trousseau for the princess, although these had to be returned as it was illegal to use somebody else's coupons. The dress, with a sweetheart neckline, fitted waist and panelled skirt, was designed by Norman Hartnell and was said to have been inspired by Botticelli's painting of Primavera, the goddess of spring. The embroidery, decorated with thousands of crystals and seed pearls, is stunningly beautiful, and as always with royal occasions, showcases British fabric and workmanship. The pageantry of the occasion helped to lift the hearts and minds of a people who had undergone severe hardship and loss, but who were very much looking forward to a new era of peace and prosperity. When clothing is dictated by shortages of time, money and material, the art of fashion stops. The dress worn in 1941 does not obviously reflect the shortages, but the style is very much that of the Hollywood films of the late 1930s. The dress from the 1950s, on the other hand, though made and worn during the time of post-war austerity and utility, is already beginning to show the relaxation of those restrictions and follows Dior's new look with its extravagant use of material and its silhouette of tight waist and spreading skirts. There were quite a lot of dresses from the 1950s in the exhibition, showcasing rich materials such as guipure lace and reflecting an era when there was more money for luxuries and a wider choice of fabrics. The two dresses shown here show simplicity of style, with the waist firmly in its natural place, but plenty of body in the skirts. Some of the other dresses from the 50s and 60s were more elaborate, with beautifully worked detail, and some of these can be seen on a slide at the end of this presentation. During the 1960s, young people suddenly had more access to money, and their tastes became an important force in the history of clothes. This movement brought about a deliberate change in culture, rejecting the styles of the 50s and asserting, amongst other things, the cult of youth and the swinging 60s. The miniskirt, the shift dress, and late in the decade the revived Empire line all came into fashion. The examples shown here, a simple shift dress with no waistline whatsoever and an Empire line waist, reflect the styles of the time but retain the tradition for the long white wedding dress, including a skirt with a train. In the 70s and 80s, by contrast, as maxi-length dresses became fashionable and as the straight styles were replaced with flowing lightweight fabrics and ethnic prints, other colours returned to the wedding dress. This eclectic range of dresses shows a growing willingness to depart from the tradition of the white wedding. During the later decades of the 20th century, the ideal of the white wedding was increasingly challenged. The elegant dress on the right, with its fur effect stole, harks back to the earlier days of the 20s and 30s. In fashion history, this sits firmly in the tradition of the great film stars of that era. One can imagine Greta Garbo or Katharine Hepburn slinking down the aisle in this. The lovely trouser suit with its Nehru jacket not only manages to be very much of its time, but also makes a nod to the 20s and 30s, when women wearing trousers for leisure was both a novelty and a statement of rebellion. Wearing trousers for a bridal outfit would have been unthinkable before the second half of the 20th century, and was popularised when Bianca Macias married Mick Jagger in 1970. Although the traditional wedding dress still holds sway, the elegant trouser suit has also found a place in the wedding pantheon of clothes. Only in the last 100 years have women been able to wear trousers without causing shock and horror. By the earlier part of the 21st century, a new fashion came into being. Popularised by the fashions of historical dramas, the style harks back to the Spanish surcoat of the Tudor period. One of the most interesting things about wedding dresses is how often they do refer back to other periods of history, and how splendid they look as the bride sweeps down the aisle. Alternative wedding themes, sometimes reflecting the interests of the wedding couple, have helped to popularise this kind of fashion. And here, in the last decade, this lovely dress with its beautiful lace fabric echoes the dress worn by a bride in 1959. A stunning but traditional white wedding dress making a comeback. All clothes have a story to tell, and whilst wedding dresses are intensely personal to the wearer, and many may reflect the times when they were worn, they also reflect the individual status and taste of the bride who wore them. As this collection shows, across the ages, for many women, the traditional white wedding remains a ceremony of choice. The detail on some of the gowns is lovely, from the beautifully embroidered leaves on this delightful dress on the left to the simple elegance of a tiny pattern of embroidery on an otherwise very simple style. All the wedding dresses in this exhibition, and it hasn't been possible to talk about them all, have been carefully preserved by the women who wore them. Some of them, like the Victorian dress, may find their way into museums. Others may become cherished heirlooms and be worn by descendants. The care and attention that went into their making reflects the importance and uniqueness of the day. Even into the early years of the 21st century, a wedding remains an important ritual and an occasion when much expense and care is lavished on the bridal apparel. Some dresses were lovingly made by the bride or her relatives, others by local dressmakers, or perhaps came from high-end stores or couturiers. For many women, it is the one time in their lives when they experience the pleasure of a garment made exclusively to fit them and that feels uniquely their own. The exhibition was also about bridal bouquets, and these too have their history. In Roman times, floral garlands celebrated fertility and new life. In later years, when personal washing was considered injurious to health, they helped to ward off disease and the unpleasant scents of unwashed bodies. In Victorian times, they assumed a new significance as the language of flowers took hold, and traditionally it was a groom who sent the flowers to the bride on the morning of their wedding day. Queen Victoria, getting married in February, carried snowdrops as they were said to be Albert's favourite flower. In her hair she wore a wreath of orange blossom, perhaps because one of her engagement gifts from Albert, who liked to design jewellery, had been a brooch of gold and porcelain orange blossoms. Since that time, orange blossom has become a symbol of marriage, although many brides simply choose their favourite flowers or the flowers that are best for the season of the year or to match their dress.